Hello, everybody. Good evening, and thank you all for coming. Um, so, Piyush, you'll remember that after your first SR Nathan lecture, I messaged you to say that's going to be a hard act to follow. Well, I have to say that you've surpassed yourself. So, congratulations, and thank you for sharing in such rich detail the digital journey of Singapore's financial industry. But a lot of what you say, of course, raises many questions, which is what we are going to get into now. So everybody, please prepare your questions. There have been such stimulating things that Piyush has revealed to us that I'm sure you have plenty. But let me just start first, okay? So Piyush, you mentioned the explosive rise of fintechs and other non-banks in the financial system. They've improved access to financial services for both businesses and consumers. You have these companies providing things like BNPL, buy now, pay later. They're providing insurance. They're even providing loans tied to their whatever businesses they're in. Now, but these entities are not as well regulated as banks, right? Yet they have credit lines with banks in many cases. They also provide services to banks. They cooperate with banks. So now, would it be possible that problems in some of these places, like, for example, if they have repayment problems in an e-commerce company, or you have a fintech systemic problem with a fintech, would this not spill over to the banking system? In the US, it's happening. You have these private credit companies, some of which have run into problems, and then it is affecting the mainstream banking sector. And I think Jamie Dimon recently said that, yes, it's happening, and there's usually more than one cockroach. So I'm just saying, would it be a problem that could affect the Singapore system as well?
So, Vikram, first of all, thank you for your kind words. You know, the short answer is why I focus so much on this balance between regulation, trust, and stability is if you don't proactively think about a balanced growth of the sector, what you're suggesting could happen. And by now, the bulk of regulation, think about banking, tends to be on the liability side. You protect depositors because that's where the bulk of you're taking people's money. And therefore, regulation really focuses on saying, how do you protect people so that the savings don't get lost? And if you lose money, if a bank loses money, the first call should not be the depositor, it should be the shareholder. So if the shareholder loses money, too bad. I mean, that's the logic of market capitalism. But it is true that if too much shareholder money is lost and the banks don't have enough of it, it spills over into systemic risk. And we've seen examples of that. Yeah. So how do you guard against that? Number one, you've got to make sure that the people who enter the industry and the sector have a minimum degree of capitalization and capital requirements. So when MES first started looking at capital requirements for non-bank players, there was a little bit of a hue and cry saying, why so much capital in Singapore? You know, why do you want? I think it was sensible. Because if you want to guard against systemic risk, you want to make sure that players have capital. Because capital is the ultimate source of saying that's where the first loss goes. Second is liquidity. Most banks, you look at China, the biggest issue that the banking sector had with Alibaba and WeBank is they had neither capital requirements nor liquidity requirements. Now, it turned out they were okay, they didn't have a problem. But the bank's biggest beef used to be that, these private operators have no constraints on this. Suppose they blow up, they could damage the whole sector. MS was thoughtful. So they put in liquidity requirements, they put in requirements for how much money you need to keep. And honestly, a lot of the fintech companies in the beginning weren't happy. They said, you should throw it open like other countries have. My view is that what we do in Singapore, this balance between ensuring stability, continuing to push innovation, has stood us over the long term. And if we continue to do that, then hopefully we don't run into the kind of situation that you're talking about, where there is a spillover from unregulated players into the regulated industry and sector.
Well, thanks. That's reassuring. I think we have some people lined up to ask questions. Yes, sir. Could you also please identify yourself? Thanks.
Thank you very much for your profound insight and wisdom, always, Mr. Gupta. My name is Patrick. I have two quick questions. How do you balance bold innovation with financial prudence? And what would it take for Singapore to reach STI 10,000 and doubles its GDP to 1.4 trillion? Thank you.
Let me take your second question first, right? I mean, I saw that report as well. The first thing you got to understand about the report is it is 2040. Right? So the minute you say that by 2040 we will hit STI 10,000 and double GDP, then you just have to apply the CAGR to get from 2025 to those numbers by 2040. It doesn't require an extraordinarily high CAGR growth. It requires a reasonable CAGR growth. So the power of compounding is massive. You compound over 15 years, you get some fairly large numbers. Right? So as long as we keep doing what we've been doing in recent times, just the power of compounding will get you to circa those kinds of numbers. The issue of innovation and prudence, it's a tough challenge. I call it an art and not a science. Because every time you innovate, it's a new way of doing stuff. Most of our regulation tends to be backward looking. I'm not just saying MES. As people, as human beings, we guard against the failures that we saw. I often reflect that for the last 15 years, the banking sector's focus on the Basel regime has been capital and liquidity, which were the failures of the GFC. The GFC, global financial crisis, was 2009. Right? So we are still putting in place protection against the failures of 2009, as opposed to thinking about regulation that informs the potential risk going forward. That's just human nature. You know what you know, and then you try to regulate around what you know. But what happens then is that people start pushing the envelope, and you have two ways of trying to deal with it. One way is to say, no can do. Just don't understand, put down the barriers, and say won't do any of this stuff. I found that what that typically does is not that it kills innovation, it pushes innovation out to the frontier boundaries. It takes it out of the regulated landscape. So Vikram, you just talked about, after GFC, as all the regulations tightened on the regulated sector, it's not that the risk disappeared. The risk got squeezed out into private equity, private credit, a whole bunch of other non-regulated parts of the industry because we tightened and controlled one part of the industry. So risk tends to disperse. The problem with that is that then you're running completely blind. Right? People are doing things and you're going to come after the fact and clean. I think the sensible and balanced regimes are the ones which don't say no can do, but start thinking about how can we do it in moderation and how can we test and learn. And that's why I called out the sandbox regime that MES first came up with, which is to say, okay, you can try it, do it in a small place, we'll see and test and learn before we take it and scale it up. So if you do that, then I think you can get the balance right between both innovation as well as making sure that you are prudent at a systemic level. When it comes to an individual choice, you always have the choice. How prudent do you want to be and what kind of risk do you want to take? And I tell people, you also, like in life, you diversify everything. So, should you invest in Bitcoins as part of the thing? Financial prudence would say, maybe don't touch it, nobody knows. But if you were to take a punt saying this is going to be the future, right, then you say, okay, maybe I want to take a little bit of that future and take a chance on it. Now, that's a balance between prudence and, regulatory oversight. So I think like in everything in life, you need to get that balance right. Don't fall entirely one way or the other way.
Thank you. So, on the 2040 question, Piyush, I have to say that any forecast that's more than 3 years ahead, I think is titillating but has no practical.
I'm 200% with you. I'm 200% with you.
Okay. Anyway, sorry. Next question. Yeah. Identify yourself, please, first. Yeah.
My name is Satya. I work for an international bank called SMBC. Piyush, thank you very much for yet another tour de force, this time on digital banking. My question, and I really liked, having worked in transport for a very good part of my life, I liked your analogy of particularly the evolution of digital banking and the scam issue to transport in the early 20th century. My question is obviously the evolution of insurance to address a lot of the, shall we say, risks that arise from interactions between players in transport. How do you see that evolving in particularly the scam sphere and cybercrime? Because I don't see enough has evolved there with regard to that. Thank you.
So that's a really good question, and your observation's exactly right. So, I've explored extensively seeing whether we could get insurance, both for cyber crime as well as for scams and frauds. And most insurance companies are reluctant to provide insurance because the downside risk can be quite unlimited. So it's hard to put your hands around it. And people have not been able to model, what is the likelihood of this risk. And therefore, people have been reluctant to put shareholder capital to give you protection against these risks in an unlimited kind of way. For my money, I think the answer to this is back to, I think we need to socialize these at state level. I think it will be hard for private sector to insure, but I think you need to socialize some of these risks at state level. If we believe, for example, we take a country, if we believe that being a digital leader, being fast forward in the digital space comes with some element of risk, we might want to take a stab at saying we will put a protection reserve for force majeure kind of situations which are systemic as a whole. And do that in the interest of building innovation and a cutting edge position. Now, it's not something that I know enough about or thought about, but I tend to believe that that might be a better way to do it, to see if we take a bet on it as a state as opposed to rely on private capital to achieve this.
Sorry, Piyush, let me just, are you suggesting that the state should provide, for example, insurance against scams, victims? Is that what you're saying? Because privately, there are about half a dozen insurance companies that do provide high cyber insurance, including for scams, but the payouts are very limited. They're limited to, I think, 25K, and the take-up is very less. So actually, society is not really well covered. So, but if the government were to provide insurance, they could charge a premium, they could also have an excess loss clause to prevent moral hazard. So is that what you're recommending?
Yeah. So Vikram, my general view is in some places where we take a view as a nation that, for Singapore's future, this is where competitive advantage will lie for us as a country. And if we can build a position in these areas, this could help cement our future in the long term. Then it might make sense for the state to lean in to create the conditions that is possible to create such a future. Okay. And leaning in, if it means, for example, creating a different kind of social safety net. So you encourage people and create the confidence that this is an okay thing to do, recognizing that there's some third sigma standard deviation risk, which the state says, okay, we will underwrite. It might not be an illogical way to create state direction.
Okay, interesting. Sorry, next question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
Sorry. We take the federal deposit insurance program.
Yeah.
We do it as well, right?
Yeah.
We provide deposit insurance cover to all citizens. Yeah. We get the banks to pay some part of the premium, but it's a national program. Yeah. Why? Because in those days we said we need to encourage our people to all become depositors. We got to create monetization or a banking this thing in the system. So the state leaned into it. They created a system where the banks pay for it, right, indirectly. But the state led the process saying, give confidence to people saying your money is safe. Yeah. So this is another way of saying, how can the state lean into giving confidence to people that you're safe?
Yeah. We also provide universal health insurance. Okay, yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Hi, I'm Rithvika. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg News, and I have two questions for you today. Piyush, with the ramping up of AI in Singaporean banks, how do you maintain morale and productivity when employees know that AI might automate their jobs? And what's the right balance between retraining, redeployment, and difficult conversations about redundancy? That's the first question. And then my second question is about stablecoins. And what's the biggest risk that stablecoins pose to banks' payments? business, and should banks be more worried than they currently are?
So your first question, Vikram was going to ask if you didn't ask it. So,
Save me the trouble.
so here's, first of all, in dealing with employees and this thing, let me start with the microprism. We've had this challenge for several years. My general view is if you're willing to reskill your people, if you're willing to bring them under the tent and find them opportunities to get better and do alternate jobs, people come along for the journey. I think everybody wants to make a difference. Each one of us is changing in our personal life. Like it or not, you're using GenAI for every app that's on your phone today. So when you start using it in your personal life, there is no reason why you won't use it in a professional context. As long as you're trained to do it, you're allowed to reskill, you can figure that you can do it in a healthy way. By and large today where GenAI is, if you do constructive, people realize it's in a co-pilot stage. It's not in the job replacement stage, it's the job enhancement stage. So for the time being, I think people are relatively secure that it's helping reduce their workload, reduce the thing, and you can work down that path. Where do we go from here is honestly a little unclear to me. I do think that there are some serious risks with AI, GenAI particularly, around job displacement. So, we think about most white-collar jobs. Right? We do 4 things. We read stuff, we synthesize stuff in our mind, we produce output, maybe an email or something, and then we take some action, send a follow-up or do an accounting entry. GenAI does all of that. It reads better than we do. It synthesizes better than we, summarizes it all. It actually produces presentations and output, and it can, do your accounting entries for you. Agentic AI does that. So when you get to the stage where you say, and this is all in 2 years, 2.5 years, it goes to a stage where it's doing it reasonably well. You fast forward and you look at the weekly improvement in AI and the models. It's not illogical to believe that a large chunk of it GenAI could do. And if that's the case, then in the short term, it could actually wind up with displacing a lot of the jobs as we know them. Right? However, I also have a different thing, which is faith in humanity and mankind. And to me, I'd like to go back to the transport analogy that you liked, Shyam. So you could argue that when mankind moved from the stagecoach to the motor car, anybody who was a stableman, looked after horses, was a stagecoach driver, all those jobs went. Right? And believe me, it's not even every stable or horseman or learned how to become a chauffeur. They didn't. Right? But overall, systemically, society created more jobs. It created more economic activity, created more jobs, and a new breed of people were able to benefit from that shift. So I am generally an optimist. My belief is that there will be challenge because I think there will be job displacement. I think the transition will not be easy. So far, the last 10 years of digitalization, if you're smart, you've been able to reskill and find the jobs. Going forward, I think some people will find it challenging. But if you were to fast forward another 5 years beyond that or 10 years, I think society will find ways to leverage and grow and create alternative professions and alternate jobs. So I do think, yes, we have to be thoughtful. I don't think we should sweep the problem under the carpet. I think the transition will be a problem, and we need to work assiduously at reskilling and teaching people the skills and tools to do the new kinds of roles.
Okay. Thank you.
Interesting what you said about the second and third order effects. It's not just the immediate effect of bankers losing their job. I mean, the most classic example of automation affecting jobs is from your industry, the ATMs. Yep. That replaced tellers. But then tellers, because of that, banks were able to expand their branches, and then there are some tellers became RMs. There were RMs increased in number, so in the second order effects, jobs increased actually. But now, of course, you have RMs being displaced by agentic AI, right?
So I think, Vikram, in 2016, when we started digitization, we identified at DBS 1,200 jobs which I knew would go, just through automation and digitization. So we engaged the unions and we engaged the staff and said, these jobs won't be here in 3 years. But we will help you find corresponding jobs, reskill you, and find you new roles. Out of the 1,200, we reskilled all of them. 300 quit and went and retired. 900 we were able to place. Right? So I felt very confident, never laid off anybody. I've never laid off anybody in this thing. I worry a lot more about AI. Because, in AI, this idea of reading, synthesis, output, that's 40% of what we do. That's 60% of what we white-collar workers do. So I think the transition will be a lot more complex, not easy. But like every time we've been through a technology displacement, the global economy has only grown and prospered, and new jobs have got created. And so you've got to bet on our ingenuity and our capacity to thrive in a system that continues to grow.
Yeah. But the jobs may be in something completely different.
They could be
not banking or whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
By the way, since
Sorry.
one of the in my other hat at SMU, where people keep talking about the future of education, and I have a very contrarian view. I'm convinced that the era of domain specialization is becoming less and less relevant, because domain specialization, the computer will always know more than you. You press a button, you take the subject, press a button, and ChatGPT, Perplexity will do a synthesis and give you a 2-page summary of the subject that you can never know and never remember, right? It'll tell you in 2 pages what it's all about, right? But I think the future will belong to people who can establish context, who can get the horizontal, who can find the solutioning, who can piece things together. And then if you can do that, you can create, by the one thing, I think it'll be a lot more entrepreneurship. People will leverage these things to get a lot more ideas and push a lot more entrepreneurship. So,
Sorry, I've been neglecting this side of the room, so we have a question from you. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, good evening, Mr. Piyush and Mr. Vikram. So I'm Rowan and I'm a banking student at Nanyang Poly. So on behalf of all my schoolmates there, thanks for the sharing. Because when we talk about fintech, right, fintech is a very new subject in school that's being heavily emphasized. So seeing how quickly your tech has evolved over the past 2-3 years, looking at AI, generative AI, right, and how good AI like ChatGPT can be in solving technical problems. So knowing these capabilities, right, how do we make sure that as graduates in the foreseeable future, how do we make sure our skill sets would still be in demand by your banks, and how do we make sure that the job market still requires our demands still demands our skill sets that would not be able to be replaced by AI? Because it can be scary at times.
Yeah. So sort of my last comment at the end of my last question, but let me emphasize that again. 5 years ago, and part of the Institute of Banking and Finance in my Workforce Singapore, we were doing a study of the future needs of Singapore grads. And the number one shortage in skills that we identified was coding, right? So computer engineers, coding. So in the last 2 years, all tech companies have stopped hiring coders. Right? In 3 years, it all changed, right? Because it said ChatGPT can do the coding, so don't need to hire coders. So to me, the main thing for all of young kids, right, be horizontal. Do a little bit of a lot of things. I'm not saying don't do any domain, of course you need. But do a little bit of a lot of stuff so you get context. You understand how things fit together. And that is something which will allow you uniquely to problem solve and therefore be entrepreneurial, find new opportunity and find new solutions. One of my favorite books I read recently is a book called Range by an author called David Epstein. The full title of the book is Range, Why Generalists Succeed in a Specialized World. That's the title of the book. And he makes effectively this case, that if you really look at people who are able to succeed, it's people who've been able to build a lot of general skills. And in fact, I tell people who are like you doing computer science, please also study philosophy and psychology as you go along. I'm convinced the biggest problems with technology in the coming decade are not problems of coding or program. There'll be problems of philosophy. What makes us human beings? Why are we what we are? Is it right to do this or not right to do this? Those problems, you can marry these problems of philosophy and organization behavior, psychology of people, why do people, into technology, you will really be quite uniquely placed.
That's great career advice, right?
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yes, ma'am.
Evening, I'm Claire, a JC1 student from Daman High School. So my question today is, how can students like myself, who are still unsure of whether we want to go into finance, help ourselves make a more informed decision on what course to study in university and how to better prepare ourselves? Thank you.
Similar question.
Yeah, but So it's fine. Let me tell you, very perplexing truth. 95% of people who work in a bank don't know anything about finance. Because banking is a very general discipline. I meant it honestly. 5% of people need to know finance, which is corporate finance. If you're in derivatives, structured trading, corporate finance, that's about 5% of the population. The rest of the 95%, banking is a very general management skill. So we need people with marketing skills, people with comm skills, people with technology skills, people with... and so you don't have to know hardcore finance. But as Vikram said, my comments are pretty much the same. To be a good banker in finance in general, learn a lot about a lot of things. Economics is always good to know, but so is psychology, so is anthropology. A little bit of a lot of things helps you be a good banker or a good finance person.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, good afternoon, sir. My name is W2. I'm from Singapore and West Johor. Now, with the reinventing of finance in the digital age, we are seeing an exponential increase in data, especially in data storage. Perhaps would you share with us how are this data being kept and scattered? What happens, say, if a data center experiences a physical attack by, unknown people? How strong is the integrity of the storage of all this data? Are we in Singapore prepared for data outages, redundancy plans, so on and so forth? Question number 2, are we prepared, say, for a change in the current reserve currency system? Do we have a plan B, say, overnight, the powers above should just decide to declare a major change in the mode of currency transaction in world trade? Please forgive me for my scattered questions because I'm not as educated as many of you are. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. So on the data, I think there are two sub-themes to that. One is, do we have redundancy in data? Which means that if something goes down, data center goes down, etc., you can still access and use data. I think most large data providers, whether it's the cloud service providers, Amazon, Google, etc., they all have distributed data centers. They make sure the data is replicated across centers. They have server farms everywhere. So I think by and large redundancy exists. The second nuance to the question, though, is are they protected against data loss? That means you have redundant data because somebody steals the data and use the data. And again, given all of the scandals in past years, any large provider is quite focused on trying to do that, third-party providers, especially the public providers. However, at an individual firm level, it depends on your various data policies and security policies. So when you look for data protection, I think the best in class is one, you need peripheral defense. So you need to make sure that can people get in. So are your firewalls okay? Are your external devices okay? At my old company, DBS, my CISO used to tell me we have 7 layers like an onion ring. We have 7 layers of the onion ring and people have to get through 7 layers to actually get to the data types. It's not easy. So most good companies do that. The second thing, though, that companies do increasingly on data is microsegment the data. So if somebody does get in, you only get into a small part of the data. You don't get into the entire data block. So you create small micro segments of data to protect. And third thing companies do is use things like unusual, they use AI to see is the data flow looking okay or does it look like the data is being misused. So they have AI at the back to check against it. Now, despite all that, you constantly see situations where there is data loss, state actors have come in. So it's a constant battle. It's a cat and mouse game. And how best do you protect it? In Singapore, the Singapore government has done a really good job identifying critical infrastructure. So what is the critical infrastructure in the country? And those critical infrastructure, whether it's provided by the public or the private sector, gets an unusually high degree of requirement. The bar is quite high on how you have to deal with that and what kind of data you have to deal with. On the question of reserve currency, it's actually, there is no powers that be who decide what the reserve currency is. Right? The reserve currency is the US dollar today because people tend to believe in the US dollar. It's a liquid market, it's a deep market, 71% of all trade in the world is denominated in US dollars, and that's what tends to make it the reserve currency. Reserve currencies are very, very difficult to shift. The US became the world's largest economy around 1870. Nevertheless, the sterling stayed the dominant currency in the world till the Second World War. So 70 years later, the power of the sterling eroded and the dollar became more powerful. So it takes time because we human beings are creatures of inertia. So for the reserve currency move away from the dollar is not going to be easy. And ironically, I will talk about it in my third lecture, as we are moving to a stable coin regime, 71% of global trade is denominated in US dollars. 96% of all stable coins have dollar assets behind them. So in fact, instead of being less dollar dependent, we're actually getting to be more dollar dependent in a regime and world of stable coins. But yeah, there are some challenges, and again, we'll hold it for the next lecture. But there are alternatives. I mean, the gold standard was the standard at one stage, and so you're already seeing, a lot of people are rebuilding gold reserves and so on. We can talk about it the next time.
Thanks. I've got a message here which says, please wrap up. We're out of time. But I think, Nolene, did you have a question? Yes, please. Yes.
Thank you very much for that wonderful lecture. 30 years ago, I was at the Fourth World Conference on Women, sitting with Mohammed Yunus, Elabad from Sewa, and we launched a global campaign on microfinance. So 30 years later, it's just wonderful to see this amazing transformation. And I was just in India recently talking to the Self-Employed Women's Association, only to find the transformation that this has impacted in terms of people's lives, especially in terms of the rural women. So that was really outstanding. But increasingly of concern is the fact that whilst that transformation is happening, the scamming industry has also transformed itself. And I am very aware of the scamming centers in Myanmar, in Thailand, and Cambodia. And they have access data on individuals as well, and they know the vulnerabilities of individuals. Can there be a major educational campaign at the national level run by the banks and the fintech entities to educate individuals? But one thing is to have the banking systems of protection, but the best way is actually to alert the individuals of their own vulnerability and how that is being used. And I'm wondering, what is that possibility?
I think it's a real possibility. We actually started trying to do that last year across the banks and public sector. We created a mascot which Iboon at ABS came up with, like a chameleon, and to drive a national education program for that purpose. I don't think we scaled it enough. So it's still quite niche. But I'm completely with you. So when I say that it needs a systemic response, everybody has to learn. So it becomes ingrained in the system. You think about it, in 1850, if there's a young kid, they would walk anywhere in the street. You wouldn't think about a road or not road. You crossed wherever you wanted. Today, no kid born would ever think of doing that. You ought to look to see, where is the traffic coming from, what is right, what is left, is the green light going on, and so on. The psyche of society has changed, so it's become second nature. The only way we will battle the scams and so on is when being cautious and understanding becomes second nature for all of us. And that transition requires to be catalyzed through exactly what you're saying, Ronin. More education, more pushing, creating a national thing. That is the only way you get there.
Very good. On that note, I'm afraid we have to call this to a close, but not before we thank Piyush for a stimulating lecture, fascinating ideas, and a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank
Piyush.
you. Thank you, Vikram.